All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another on-demand session for the 2022 Top Crop Summit. My name is Stephanie Crowley. I'm the editorial director at Top Crop Manager magazine, and I'm joined today by Clark Brenzil with Sask Ag. Nice to see you, Clark. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, glad to be here.
Could you start just by introducing yourself for our viewers who don't know you and share a little bit of your background and your role?
My name is Clark Brenzil. I work for the Ministry of Agriculture in Regina, and I'm the provincial specialist in weed control. I've been in that position since January of 1998. So I'm one of the silverbacks, as one of the people that I work with would have said. What I do is I generally provide information to producers on weed control, herbicide choices, things like that. I provide advice to not only producers, but also government departments, municipalities, etc. So it's a fairly broad audience that I generally have to work with.
Excellent. So today we're going to talk a little bit about herbicide carryover. Obviously, we can't stop talking about the drought that Western Canada experienced in 2021. There are so many long-term impacts of that. And herbicide carryover, I know, is a risk even sometimes in non-drought years, but especially when it comes to seasons like we experienced in 2021. So maybe you can talk about some of those risks of herbicide carryover, especially after a dry season, and how much rain or moisture would have been required over the growing season to reduce the risks that maybe wasn't experienced this past year.
Yeah, I think to start, we kind of have to go into kind of a little bit of the process of breakdown and just kind of cover that a little bit. There's two main pathways of breakdown for herbicides. One is through microbial activity in the soil, and the other is through a process called hydrolysis. With microbial activity in the soil, essentially you've got a variety of different bacteria and fungi that are going to essentially use those herbicides as a food source. So they'll start cleaving off molecules, and they'll use the carbon for energy and the hydrogen, and they'll use the phosphorus and nitrogen and those things for various different parts of their growth over time, right? And so essentially they're living organisms. They need moisture to survive. And so where we find most of our herbicide is relatively close to the surface in a no-till system. And so we have to have relatively consistent moisture for relatively long periods of time in order for those microbes to be able to thrive. And if they're thriving, then they're breaking down the herbicide. In a drought year like we've had, they're short on moisture, and so they're not thriving. And maybe some of those little sprinkly rainfalls that we got, they may wet the soil surface for maybe 15 minutes to an hour, but that's not sufficient to get that microbial population activated, because there is a bit of a lag time there from exposure to moisture until you've got a fairly active population of microbes to be able to break down those herbicides. There are some herbicides that, one thing I should say is that the other element to the close proximity to the soil surface is that most of these microbes are aerobic microbes, so they require oxygen as well. So if your herbicide gets too deep in the soil, then those microbes can't break it down as fast either. So it even for normal breakdown, it has to be relatively close to the soil surface. And there are some herbicides that, like group 3s, that break down things without oxygen faster. But that's generally the exception rather than the rule. The other breakdown pathway that we talked about was hydrolysis. And essentially what's happening there is that you've got a water molecule that's exposed to the herbicide. It cleaves that molecule in half, the herbicide molecule in half, and it deactivates it. There's other processes that'll take place to break down that herbicide further, but essentially it's gone from being a herbicide to being a couple of different herbicide components, but not really herbicidally active. So that's the real pathway. And so again, it requires moisture in the soil. So I think that's the real key, is that moisture is important for the two main pathways of herbicide breakdown. So saying that, if we have adequate moisture for breakdown, and what we're really referring to when we talk about that is predictable breakdown within our normal sphere of moisture. So there'll be herbicides that are used in Ontario or something like that that aren't relevant to Western Canada because they get more moisture and they have a longer growing season than us. So the other component to that is also time, that you have to have the conditions for breakdown existing for a long enough period of time at reasonable temperatures in order for things to take place.
Right.
So I think what we're really talking about when we talk about problems with herbicide carryover is that carryover is not predictable. When we have lots of moisture, then it's predictable. And we can say, oh yeah, you can grow this, this, and this, and you can't grow this, this, and the other thing. So I think that's the real key part of it. And as a general rule, we talk about moisture between the 1st of June and the 1st of September or end of August, essentially, because that's when we have the period where generally we have adequate warm temperatures for soils or for microbes to be active, and for that chemical hydrolysis to take place at a really rapid pace. It's a period of time where we've got free moisture available. So in the wintertime, all the moisture is tied up as ice and it's really cold, so none of the reactions take place. And it's that period of time where you're essentially going to have good biological activity taking place. And so to kind of turn that background, the risk of carryover again is also relative to the herbicide. And some are going to require more moisture than others. We've kind of got an upper end of that range that some might require as much as 6 inches for breakdown, and then there's others that might require as little as 4 inches. Below that 4 inches, we can probably say that, well, all those ones that are impacted by this dry weather are going to be impacted below that level. If we've got greater than 6 inches of rainfall, then we can generally say as a rule that we're going to have relatively predictable breakdown. And so that's kind of where we sit here in Western Canada.
Gotcha. Lots to digest there with that. So obviously something that we say in agriculture all the time is there's no kind of one size fits all solution, but sometimes there's no one size fits all problem either. It sounds like,
Yeah.
yeah. Is there, and I know you mentioned this a little bit, but so some herbicides will come with increased risk over others. Are there, on the same topic, are there some crops that will come with increased risk of sensitivity to herbicide carryover as well?
Yeah, and that risk of injury from the herbicide is kind of, it depends on the herbicide as well. Which crops are going to be affected. So every herbicide, regardless of what family it falls in, has a certain sensitivity range, and certain crops are going to be sensitive and other crops are not going to be sensitive. And so there'll be a range along a spectrum as well, because you'll have some that are really sensitive, some that are not sensitive at all, and then there'll be the full spectrum in between. So from that perspective, sometimes it is really, it kind of depends on the herbicide. And you can get a bit of a feel for that in our guide to crop protection on page 180 or on 84, where we've got a chart there that talks about herbicide breakdown under normal conditions.
Okay.
And usually if we've got herbicides that are in that somewhat persistent category already, then they'll have some of those really sensitive crops that you have to kind of pay a little bit of attention to even under good years. And so that'll give us an idea that, well, okay, you're going to have a few more crops that you're going to have to pay attention to under some really dry years. So I think that reference is a really good reference. The other thing that we run into is that there's some herbicides that have multi-year recropping restrictions. And so what that means is that if you run into situations like we had last year, where we had very, very dry conditions in some areas where herbicide breakdown was next to nil, what you may have to do with those herbicides is add an additional year for every year of poor breakdown conditions that you had. So let's say you put this multi-year restricted herbicide on in 2019. Well, it would break down reasonably well in 2019, but as soon as 2020 hit, well, there's no breakdown that year. And then 2021, there's no breakdown that year. So you're kind of stuck, right? That it could have extend a 2-year breakdown window into a 4-year breakdown window. So that's something that producers need to kind of keep in mind as well. Yeah, and it all comes back to that sort of predictability idea. Crops, some are a little more persnickety than others, and in some cases that relates to seed size, because with particular herbicides, especially those that are inhibiting pathways in the plant that produce essential components for growth, which oftentimes we would refer to as systemic type herbicides. The larger seeded crop will have more of that essential component for growth to share with the seedling as that seedling is developing. And so maybe that seedling can kind of get through that layer of herbicide and kind of escape that exposure to that herbicide. Whereas smaller seeded crops, they've got a less of that essential component that they can kind of share with the seedling. So the crop gets up to a certain point and then it runs out of that essential component. You'll see the results of the herbicide being expressed very early in the life cycle. So from the crop perspective, then yeah, that's something that we could look at as well. The other part of that could be seedling depth as well. In some cases, we can seed a large seeded crop right underneath that treated layer, and it's a bit of an escape strategy. Whereas with smaller seed, we need a seed closer to the soil surface, and that's closer to where that layer is. And so when it starts developing roots, it's going to develop it right in that treated layer.
Gotcha.
And so that can be a concern as well.
Absolutely. Well, when it comes to recognizing that you have maybe herbicide injury in your field, obviously, it's something to be mindful of when you are coming off of a dry year like this, but are there other obvious kind of clues that might suggest your fields would be at risk of this? And you've spoken a little bit about that already, just alluding to, the seedling depth and seed size, but maybe even visually, is there something that would tip a grower off or a producer off to notice that there might be a concern there?
I think generally we look at rainfall in that 3-month period because everything's working really fast. If they get rainfall outside of those periods, they might be deceived into the idea that, well, I got a lot of rain on the sort of shoulders of the season, so I might be okay, right? And we had a reasonably open fall this year, as well as a little bit of precipitation that came later. Sometimes that can be deceptive as well, and make it so that producers are deceived in the idea that, well, we're going to be okay going into next year because we got that rainfall. And temperature is very important in that process. So I think we have to confine things to those 3 months. I think as a general rule, if your crops looked reasonably healthy during the growing season, particularly if you've got a year like we had going into the last couple of years where soil moisture reserve was not exactly topped up to the optimum. If you've got crops that looked reasonably healthy last year, then you're probably not going to have a huge amount of carryover going, or unexpected carryover going into next year. If you've got crops that were showing symptoms of drought, then that's an indicator that you've got stress on the biological system.
Okay.
And that, because biological systems are the major pathway of breakdown, then that's probably going to be a good indicator that well, you should be making sure you're checking to figure out what your risk is.
Gotcha. Okay. Um, it's as we look ahead, I guess, into the 2022 season, it would always be nice to, what we try to do here at the Top Crop Summit is to really provide producers with some kind of really actionable takeaways and strategies. Going into 2022, what are your top tips, Clark, for producers who are, want to be wary of this? Of course, some of this is not within our control when we don't get the precipitation and the moisture that we need. But if there are things that we can control and action that we can take, what would your advice be for producers going into spring planting and seeding?
I think the big one is just to be really conservative about your crop choices going into 2022. This is not the year to really kind of push the envelope as far as the tolerance of the herbicide. And there are some herbicides that have particular crop restrictions that I know that under normal years, producers will kind of push the envelope on what crops they seed after those particular herbicides. This is not the year to be going there. In fact, it's the year to be going exactly the opposite direction and being very, very conservative about the crops that are being chosen.
Mhm.
Those crops may not necessarily be the most lucrative, but they're going to be the most likely to actually provide you with a return
Okay.
next year. That while it may not overflow the piggy bank, it will make sure that it keeps everything afloat going forward. So I think that's number one. I think that they need to work with both their manufacturer of their residual herbicide and with their agronomist to figure out, well, what am I going to do going into next year?
Okay.
And in some cases, that may include growing the same crop again next year. And I know all the disease people in the crowd are going to start losing their minds at this point, but what we have to consider is if we're in an area where we had very high risk of herbicide carryover, we had very little rainfall to trigger any growth of disease organisms as well. They're all microbes. So they all require moisture. And if none of them got moisture and none of them are working, then the odds of there being higher inoculum for some of those disease organisms going into next year than there was at the start of this past year would be very, very low. And so it's not something you want to make a habit of, but it might be your sort of wiggle out of the corner that you've been painted into. And for a couple of different reasons, not just for the herbicide itself, but it could also be a way to utilize some of the, in some cases, herbicide, or not just herbicides, but fertilizers didn't get incorporated into the system either. So they're just sitting there waiting for somebody to use them.
Yeah.
And that might be a way to kind of manage around some of that fertilizer remaining in the soil as well. So that's number two. And then number three is that producers need to know not just what their brand names are, they need to know what their active ingredients are. If they didn't get a letter in the mail to warn them about a problem in 2022, they're not necessarily out of the woods. They may have gotten one of the generic versions of those herbicides that where
Mhm,
the proprietary company sent out the letter.
mhm,
Um, and the generic company may one not have the wherewithal to really sort of support that product, and they may not have the resources to be able to support the product and contact producers in that way. So if you've used a generic product, you really have to know what your active ingredient is going into that. And just to give you an idea of just some perspective, we've got something like 360 crop-based herbicides in our guide to crop protection, and we only have about 60 active ingredients, and then 40 of which are the more common active ingredients that get used in the cropping cycle. And then about half of those, again, or 20, are going to be residual. So you go from just this unsurmountable pack of names that you have to worry about down to like 20 that you have to think about. So if you know your active ingredients, you know which ones are at risk, then you can avoid the risk going forward as well. And not have to rely on somebody sending you the letter, so to speak, to tell you that you're going to be at risk for next year. So I think those are the real key messages for producers as we move forward.
That's great advice. It sounds like, as always, being as prepared as possible and informed as possible is especially going to be especially important in going into 2022. And as you said earlier, maybe taking some of those calculated risks and reseeding your field to the same crop as you did in 2021. And a great point about using up that fertilizer as well. So excellent advice, Clark. Appreciate it. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we sign off for today?
Uh, just just so that producers understand that 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 whole breakdown process is a really complex process, and it's not just one component, because we also have soil organic matter and we have clay and we have pH that also influence breakdown and influence how much of that herbicide is going to be available to the crop growing next year, and can really influence whether you have a crop or whether you don't. Generally, light soils are with low organic matter are the highest at risk. It doesn't mean that if you have those other kinds of soils that you're not going to be at risk. But the ones that are definitely at risk are the light soils with low organic matter. So that's another component to the breakdown, in that we really don't have any testing processes to be able to diagnose any of these things either. And that's why we need to be very conservative going into next year.
That makes sense. There's so much that happens after we spray a herbicide that we don't actually see happening. It's a pretty complex process. So
Yep.
really important to understand how that happens. So thank you very much for explaining that to our audience today. And we appreciate your time and your advice, Clark. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Stephanie.